You are listening to Cemetery Confessions, the world's #1 goth talk podcast.
Hello and welcome back to Cemetery Confessions. On this episode, we are speaking with Emma, who has spent the last 8 years collating data derived from a survey she sent out for her PhD thesis, which initially sought to answer the question, is goth just a phase? But snowballed into something so much bigger than that, because the number of respondents to this survey numbered in the thousands, which is ostensibly the largest survey of and about goth culture that's ever been created. During this episode, we'll be speaking about the themes and information gleaned from this data, including subjects such as the essential role that death plays in goth culture, both for the better and the worse, the consistent distinctiveness of goth across borders, goths' perceived resistance to the mainstream, and the role of the internet in goth culture, among other topics. Before we do jump into the episode, though, I would just like to quickly thank everyone who supports us and this podcast through Patreon. This show and the ad-free content that we produce has continued to exist over the nearly 10 years that's coming up in a couple months, due to the extremely generous support from our community. If you would like to get bonus content like our backlog of Patreon exclusive interviews and videos, or you simply appreciate that this type of content is out in the world, please be sure to check out patreon.com/cemetery confessions and consider joining for just $1 a month, which that gets you access to our Discord and early access to podcast episodes, as well as an invite to our annual video hangout where myself, Trey, and the community spend an evening together. As always, I am your host, Danny Ashes, and I'm here with my co-host, Trey. Emma, let's start out with introductions. What's your relationship with goth, and kind of when did you discover the subculture?
Okay, so I'm just going to preface all of this by saying I have got a website and it's been there for a really long time and it's a bit out of date because it was for my research, but I'm going to talk from my own perspective and my research perspective as sort of two separate but parallel things.
Mm-hmm.
So from my own perspective, I got involved in the goth scene from when I was an early teenager. I think I was about 13, 14. My cousin was really into like ska and mod and all that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And she gave me a whole bunch of tapes and was trying to find where because I didn't fit in, obviously a lot of people in this scene tend not to fit in with what's standard. And she's like, I just get the feeling there's something for you, but I can't work out what it is. So she kept sort of giving me tapes and trying to find what fitted for me. And she gave me a mixtape and there was a whole bunch of stuff on there with early Cure stuff and Sister Mercy and other stuff, a lot of Madness and, all that other stuff as well. But when I started to hear that kind of sound and that bass beat and that sort of deep rumbling goth sound, that was what really got me involved. And I was like, I love that sound and that's for me. And then she's like, oh, well, great. Okay, here's the thing for you then.
Mm-hmm.
So she gave me the Alice LP and a whole bunch of Sisters stuff, which, that's never left me. So I am a bit of a Sisters tragic, but that also gave me the insight into the concert scene, which obviously being in Australia, it's so isolated here. We had such a limited access to, what you could see. But there was this huge sort of archive of VHS and videos that were available online, or not online, but available via purchase. So you could order them from catalogs. And that's what I started doing.
Okay.
So I got this amazing guy in the UK who used to send me, and I used to just wait for them when I was like 15, 16. He used to send me these big yellow packages of VHS recordings of live gigs. And it was just amazing. So I'd get, hot off the press, as it were, video footage of the Sisters or the Mission or whatever was playing in the UK at the time. And I just thought it was amazing. And it just totally, got me involved. And then as I got older, obviously I got involved in the local scene and I went clubbing and I was a DJ for a little while, but I found that limited me too much because I really liked dancing. So rather than being a DJ, I was much more involved in organising club nights, and that's how I met my husband. We're still together. Yeah, we've been together for coming up to 30 years.
Wow.
Congratulations.
So,
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, next year's our 30th anniversary. So, and, a lot of my friends that I connected with back then are still, they're still my friends because they were authentic, genuine, real people and real friends. So that's my connection. It's really deep and it's long lasting, and it's far more than just because I like the outfits, Yeah.
It's really nice to hear that you were able to merge that passion with your PhD thesis, which is essentially what we were here to talk about for the most part. So maybe we can get some information on that. So the article that just came out in the Journal of Contemporary Gothic Studies was called Just a Phase, The Enduring Socio-Aesthetic Networks of Goth Identity.
Yeah.
So can you give us some back, because it's a huge project. There was a long time and a lot of information. So if you can kind of talk about what went into that, what it was for, all that stuff.
I did fine art and design when I left school. And I was essentially a graphic artist and designer and painter. And I'm still a painter. But I was really interested in how communities and individuals used design as their mode of being. So I got into this idea of the social plus the aesthetic. And just to preface this conversation further, in the philosophical sense or in the research sense, aesthetic does cover a great deal more than just your look or your image. So when you're talking about aesthetics, we consider in the research sense all forms of art and beauty. So that would include music, for instance, although I'm not really going to talk about that a great deal in relation to this research because I feel that's not my area of expertise.
It's also harder to broadcast that to some degree. I mean, obviously it's literally broadcast, but as far as individuals expressing their identity in a public forum, barring the boombox era of the 80s, it doesn't really get broadcast so much as as aesthetic from a visual standpoint does.
That's right. But then you have things like band T-shirts and tattoos and, people find ways of literally branding themselves with this idea of, well, this is my tribe or this is my group or this is my part of my identity is fundamentally linked to the notion of a goth aesthetic or a goth philosophy. And I phrase it as being a framework that we sort of use to scaffold around the Gothic identity or Gothic. I sort of use the terms intermittently and change them up a bit, but I do tend to prefer Goth. That's an Australian thing, I think, more than anything. We tend to say Goth rather than Gothic. I'm not sure how that translates in America. Maybe that's something we could discuss a bit further as we go. But so this paper came out of my PhD that I did after my master's, which was the master's was it was a design master's, and it was looking at the empowerment of people through the use of that, like I was saying, the design of their personal lives. And then I did the PhD, and that project was huge. It started in 2015 and it was meant to be I expected it to be a survey of around 200 people. And of course, in between doing the master's and doing the PhD, things massively changed. So we went from doing handheld surveys on paper to doing surveys online. We went from doing, interviews in pubs to doing interviews over the internet. And I ended up having over 2,000 respondents to the surveys. And on top of that, there were additional interviews and online meetings and discussions, groups, Reddit forums, Facebook forums, all sorts of different. It was much, much bigger than I anticipated. And originally when I started, it was a part-time study. And then I eventually had to go full-time to unpick all the data because it was so gigantic. So the data set that I've ended up with, I feel, is hugely important for understanding Goth communities worldwide, because it covered the Australian cohort, which had never been studied before in any depth whatsoever. So there'd never been a large-scale study of Australian Goth at all. And to my knowledge, and I'm very happy to be corrected, but to my knowledge, there'd never been a very large-scale international study either that took in Goths all over the world rather than just one location. So the data that's come out of this is, I think, hugely significant and really important to get the message across in the research space that this isn't simply, a reaction to punk or a follow-on, if you like. It's something that stands alone and is hugely significant for the people involved in it.
I don't know what happens with that data. That's something I would love to read through. I wouldn't want to try and put all the connective tissue and distill it down to a thesis, but that is an incredible amount of information.
Well,
I was kind of reading about some of the concepts of the coding and whatnot of data, especially when you're dealing with the interpretative phenomenological analyses framework that you were working within, which seems like it would be even harder with that large data set, because I think, isn't that a structure, or isn't that an analysis methodology that's designed more towards smaller cohorts with individual in-depth results rather than a large cohort like this?
That's exactly right. And that was one of the difficult, and that is indeed why it took such an extended amount of time. So it started in 2015, it concluded in 2020, in 2021 I finished the thesis and graduated in the summer of that year. But the quantity of the data and actually the quality of the data, so two distinct things, necessitated a much deeper dive than I was expecting. And what also came out of that was there was, in particular, in the data, I had allowed for participants to write their own feedback. So almost every question had a free text element to it. So there was, yes, no answers or coded answers 1 to 7, that sort of usual Likert scale response. But then there was also if you feel you would like to add more, please do so, and here's an empty space to do that. What I was really surprised by was almost every single participant gave some form of feedback of some kind. Now, some people just wrote, "Thank you very much, this was great." Some people wrote, "This survey was too long." And some people wrote wonderful, great big essays of their own. And I ended up with hundreds of thousands of responses to then deal with and manage, that obviously couldn't be dealt with just in a phenomenological manner, because I couldn't go through each one and look at every individual perspective on Goth using that mode. So then I had to do essentially a data matching traditional ethnographic approach, where I just did coding using key terms. So what came up most regularly, what came up as an outlier, what were themes between the two cohorts, what were themes within countries, what were themes within age groups, that sort of thing. And there was a lot of corresponding data points, and that was really interesting. It was hugely interesting how much the data correlated between the groups. I was expecting Australians to be quite different, and in a lot of ways they were not. So that was fascinating. But what also came out of it was that there was just so much more than I could unpick in one thesis. So what the thesis ended up being was answering the research question, was Goth a phase to most people? who'd been in the scene for a long time. So that question was more or less answered in the thesis. And then there was this secondary set of data, if you like, that was just far, far greater than that question, which will now form the basis of ongoing research and deserves to be published. And, I feel absolutely, I feel like I've been trusted by the community to use their words. So I feel beholden to do something with that information and get it out there so that people can read it and feel seen and feel heard, because some of the information that people have provided is hugely personal and some of it is really insightful. And I think, as I said, I think it's really significant in a research sense as well. It's not just people saying, I love this band. It's really significant insights into how being a goth or gothness or goth ideas are intrinsically part of who they are and how their identity has been scaffolded by goth ideas.
That is a good point, though, because we do love to talk about ourselves, but we're also, we tend to be a bit protective of who we talk about it to.
Yes.
And one of the things that I loved in the article is that you acknowledge the role of the researcher in the process of the research, which I think is something that kind of entanglement or that kind of relationship isn't really talked about as much. And I think that was probably a big part of why people felt comfortable. I don't know if you have any insights on how you sort of handled that as a researcher being, related to the subject that you're researching.
That's certainly part of the phenomenological approach, and that's essentially why I chose it from the outset. I read a lot of phenomenological studies that were completely unrelated to subculture or goth or that sort of area, but they really put the researcher within the area of study. And I was like, well, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to be seen as being part of this community, looking inward and outward. And I don't want to hide from that. I don't want to say, oh, I'm at arm's distance from these people. I don't want that kind of terminology used. I don't want that sort of, I didn't want goths to be othered. I didn't want that sense of sociological shame almost. There's a real sense to me in some of the early writings about goth that there's something wrong with being a goth. There's that real sense of othering that I find a bit uncomfortable in the text. And I wanted to ensure that people felt comfortable. I wanted to ensure that the surveys made very, very clear that I was coming from a position of understanding not only of what it was, that they were talking about, but also that I knew what it was to be uncomfortable in a social setting because of the way I looked or because of what I'd chosen to wear. And I also wanted people to understand that if they had stories about that, this was the place that they could share them. And certainly in interviews, that proved to be the case. And also I wanted to discuss things like the Sophie Lancaster case and Columbine, not because that was what I wanted to be my focus of study, but because they form a really significant turning point in the dialogue about goth in research texts. And that will actually be my next paper that I'll be bringing out shortly, hopefully. I really want there to be an understanding that had those two events not occurred or had they occurred differently, the way goth is viewed now would be, I think, really significantly different. So, I wanted people to understand that I understood that as well.
You kind of mentioned or alluded to, maybe you answered the question, but you kind of mentioned about your having some surprises or unexpected results. And that was a question that I had, because I assume going into the project, you had some degree of expectation about what subcultural members might say. And so I wanted to ask if, what things sort of surprised you the most as you were looking through the responses, if you have any.
There were some responses that I found not so much surprising, but sort of heartening to hear. I think the understanding of the idea of younger goths coming into the community being treated well or better is now better understood, and I think that's really important. I think also now the idea of the elder goth, and as someone who's very shortly to turn 50, I think the idea of the elder goth is now quite well understood, and that sort of brings a sense of, I guess it's hard to explain it in a single term, but I think it gives goth a sense of age appropriateness as well. So it gives you that full spectrum of from youth to middle to old age. You know, we've got people in the scene now who are, you know, up to 60, 70 years of age who have had a full spectrum of life in the scene. And I think that is now understood. So I don't think it's seen now as a youth culture as it once was. And I think that's really surprising, because I think the terminology used in sociological texts still kind of brands it as a youth culture, and I think, or subculture, youth subculture. And I think that's really inappropriate, really. I think it's kind of past its prime. You know, it's done its job, and it's time to move on from that. And it's very much not that anymore. But the language that the participants themselves were using was very much not that kind of language anymore. They were talking about culture, they were talking about community, they were talking about their people, they were talking about their sense of belonging within a group, you know. And I found that really heartening, if not surprising. I think there was other surprises in terms of the sense of distinct continuity in stories between locations. So that, in a sense, really did shock me. There were people who, you know, from Middle America and people from Adelaide in Australia who were telling me virtually exactly the same story of, you know, going out to a pub, going out to a club, having someone abuse them for not looking the right way or looking funny or having weird hair or whatever else, and then finding another club or another place and then fitting in because they've got weird hair and because they look a bit funny, you know.
Yeah.
And that was fascinating. But the flip side of that is it's disappointing that still happens. You know, there's still that sense of people being assaulted or abused or othered for simply the way they look. One of the other things that I found really, again, not surprising, but pleasing, was that the idea of gender fluidity and androgyny very much supported in the community, no matter where. And that was really fabulous. So particularly Southeast Asia, a few participants from Southeast Asia reported having communities that supported them there, and I found that really, really heartening.
That is absolutely wonderful to hear. Yeah, interesting as well, because I came out as genderqueer in that time period between when the research started and now.
That's right, yeah.
It's been a really wonderful experience to know that I have a community of people who support me, and I don't have to be afraid going to those spaces.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also the sense of no violence. I think that's something that is almost unique to the goth community, except maybe for hippies. Yeah, I think the sense that there's no violence in the goth community. Hippies are notorious for being peaceful and whatnot in the 60s, but I think it's quite unusual to have a sense of a peaceful culture where you can, I mean, I've had a number of particularly bar staff and door bouncers, that sort of thing, say to me, you know, we really welcome goths coming in and having club nights because we know that there's not going to be any trouble. You know, they won't drink the bar dry and get rowdy. And as soon as the band's done and the DJ's done, everyone just packs up and goes home. There's no trouble. So that, you know, that's kind of unique, I think. I think in countries where there's a real drinking culture, like Australia and Britain, that's an interesting observation, I think.
Yeah, I think there was an interesting line in your it was towards the beginning of your paper, actually, that I felt reflected that a bit when you were talking about how not specifically around violence, but you were just foregrounding the post-subculturist aspect of it, how it's not about rebellion and not about sticking it to the mainstream.
Yes.
It's about finding a community about finding support, about finding agency and, self fulfillment within a community. And
that's right.
Because of that, you're not going to have people who are starting fights and stuff, because that doesn't really, it doesn't reinforce that idea of self-determination and agency. It's more about the rebellious side, and a lot of subculture, especially youth subculture, has been tarred with that brush of It's all about just doing whatever scares the parents and the grandparents, and it's the teenagers trying to express their individuality by rejecting the outside world, or the sort of quote unquote adult world. And that is not the core of what goth is, which is something that I've always felt very happy with, because I've never been a big fan of the whole do something because it bothers somebody else.
Because it'll annoy someone else, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think also for a lot of participants in my study, in the interviews in particular, when we sat down to talk, our first sort of, much as we did today, our first question was, how did you get into the scene? Why did you find this was for you? And the first thing most people said was, apart from the music, I didn't fit in other places, and I just wanted to be comfortable and happy, So people are looking for a positive. They're not looking for somewhere to go out and, act up. They're looking for somewhere to be comfortable and find relationships and find a community where they belong, not somewhere where they can start a fight and act out and be angry at the world. They're looking for somewhere to find contentment, and that's not traditionally the way subcultures have been viewed.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Well, I want to kind of dive into various aspects of your research and tease out some of the components of that. And I thought it would be, we could start anywhere really, but I wanted to start with one of the subjects I thought was interesting, the role that the recent and distant past play in goth culture, and kind of how you see that, the past informing current day.
Yeah. I find this a really fascinating part of goth culture, because we draw on, and I will say we, because I am part of this culture. So we draw on ancient and recent historic references. So we draw on punk, we draw on medieval, we draw on Victorian. And for each individual person, we tend to find a reference point which has some kind of meaning or attraction relevant to your life. And then we build our own personal mythologies and identity points around that. So I think finding melancholic sort of escapism and beauty around those ideas of the past, or something romantic, or something even driven by fantasy or creativity and imagination, is absolutely intrinsic to the culture. But then again, you also have this idea of the Gothic writers, so Poe and Shelley and Stoker and all of those sorts of foundational writers. And, people do read those books, or they certainly like to have them on their shelves if they don't read them. I know I'm guilty of that. And, so it becomes part of the broader aesthetic. You end up with this idea of the literature being relevant. You end up with the aesthetics of the clothing being relevant. And then you can bring into it things like mourning traditions. You bring into it the idea of death and dread, and that being part of everyday life. And that becomes an overlay that we don't have in the current time period. So with the exception of perhaps COVID, which has slightly changed how things are perceived. And I will be very interested to see how that rolls out over the next 10 years. But in the Victorian era, death was very much a part of everyday life, for instance. So losing children, losing loved ones was absolutely, part of everyone's life experience. So having traditional rituals and life processes to deal with that was completely normal. We may not feel that way now. It might seem romantic, and it might seem opulent even, to have lots of velvet and lace and veils and all that sort of thing. But for them, it was a way of managing what would have been really horrifically grief-stricken existence to lose family members and children regularly. It was not something that happened occasionally. It was a regular occurrence for a lot of families. So, but we've taken that in as a culture as a way of showing that we're not afraid, or almost like we're challenging death, or we're bringing in dread and finding a way of making it. We're using a dark sense of humour and embracing it in a way that, it sort of walks the line between tasteful and not tasteful. And that's sort of how we get that line between never really quite getting into the mainstream, because for a lot of people, that is a line that, they wouldn't be comfortable to cross. So I think that's how we manage as a culture to stay within our own lane, if you like. Goths tend not to be afraid to have the skulls to look like they're maybe, death or not 100% healthy. People are not afraid to wear the makeup that makes them look terribly ill. Whereas most people are looking for that sun-kissed glow. They're not looking to feel like they're part of a death experience, particularly in Australia. It's 30 degrees today here, Celsius. I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit. Sorry,
that's warm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not a normal, if you like, way of being to be pale and unwell looking to the normal eye. So embracing that sense of a historic, sort of motley, old, death fixated lifestyle is very unusual and threatening to the mainstream. So I think it's fundamental to how Goth maintains its anchor, if you like, to the past.
Yeah, and it's one of the few things that so far has resisted heavy commodification, except seasonally, because it's such a thing that the majority of people in at least Western cultures find still so very unsettling to dwell within, that idea of memento mori and just thinking of death and existing with the acceptance and acknowledgement of death, that it can only be put on for short bursts of time for like special events for most people, whereas those of us in the Goth subculture tend to embrace it, not always easily. We struggle with it just as anybody else would.
That's right. Yeah.
But we do confront it regularly.
Yeah, and also there's a strong tradition of the bands in our culture using mystical works as reference points. There's a strong practice of role-playing, fantasy, filmic traditions, all sorts of these other things that influence on a broader level what it is that we're interested in. So if you are very well read, as many of us are, you have all this knowledge tucked away. So you might know a lot about ancient Egypt, you might know a lot about Wicca, you might know a lot about post-apocalyptic fantasies. So you draw all that into your own aesthetic playbook, if you like, and you find ways of integrating that into not just that Victorian look, but the whole Goth appearance becomes imbued with all these different historic elements. And then you can also bring in the kitsch, so you might, just to lighten it up a bit, you might add a glow-in-the-dark bat, or you might add, something that you picked up in a dollar store for Halloween or whatever that shows that you're not taking it too seriously, so it lightens the mood a little, just to show that you're not over the top. I think there's always that sense of, I'm doing this and I enjoy it, but just so you know, I'm not totally serious. There always seems to be just that one little thing that, there's a little bit of glitter or there's a little bit of something. People always seem to find a way of saying, I'm here, but, it's not 100% serious. I understand I'm aware of what I'm doing. It's very conscious. I've chosen this look. This isn't an accident. I've put this together, and this is to show that I put this together myself. So I think that's really important, that people outside the culture are aware of that. It's not just, we don't walk into a costume shop and buy a witch costume.
Right. Yeah, I think with Halloween, it kind of, like you were saying, it goes to the kitsch, because Trey, you mentioned also the seasonal thing. And for me, that's always It's sort of always felt more like a coping mechanism, was sort of like, oh, I have a spooky skeleton, but why is it spooky? You know, did somebody think about, oh, it's because I'm going to die one day, and there's a skeleton inside me. I think the thing, my main criticism about the relationship with death in goth culture that I've been thinking about the last month or so was the way that goths engage with death and avoid the politics of death. Because I think, you know, death is obviously political. How we die, where we die, how we're taken care of after death, that's all legislated. And I had been watching Dr. Cami Fletcher recently talking about the different ways in America specifically there are barriers and segregations and like generational systematic systems that are racist and classist that kind of shape the dying process for Black people and white people and Indigenous people differently. And for me...
Oh, and financially as well. It's a hugely economically driven system.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I just don't think that you can really separate the political aspect of death because it shapes and forms our expression and understanding of death in some way. Yes. And it's frustrating to me that we do pride ourselves on our existential musings of death. But then a lot of us try to stay apolitical, which I think is impossible, but we sure do try sometimes. And,
I agree with that 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. I just think that the phenomenon of death, it's not like we can't view it as objectively existing in nature, independent of things like politics or human intervention or, you know, the practices and materials and technologies around death are all always already connected. And that's just been the one sort of fly in my soup around the way that we think about death. But
I agree with that. And I think the idea of romanticizing death, as the goth culture, undeniably does, I think is completely fraud. And I think that is why there's this sort of tongue-in-cheek glittery bat phenomenon that occurs where people sort of say, oh, but didn't you see my shiny bat? You know, it's like, it's, I think it's incredibly tricky for people to walk that line. And particularly when you've been affected by death personally, you suddenly become very aware that it's really quite distasteful in some ways to perpetuate this idea that it's, I don't know, kind of groovy to celebrate the idea of, you know, death in a way that doesn't acknowledge all of the suffering around it. I guess what I would also say to that is that there's been a huge movement here in recent years to address some of that. I recently went to what's called the Goldfields Gothic Festival in Malden in Victoria, and there were public panels where people from the death industry gave talks. And actually one of my very good friends, Lindy Shaw, gave a speech, which was fantastic. And she spoke about the process that people go through when they die. So being a mortician assistant and and it's incredibly real. You know, there's no denying what happened to people when they die. And I think the more people know about that process and the more informed they are, the better, really. I mean, it's the only way to combat such sort of, you know, glib approaches to it. Right.
Yeah. The other thought I had on, just very quickly, about the past and goth culture. I've always loved how explicit that relationship is in goth, because I do think identity is historically situated and kind of in conversation with the past. We just don't often make that explicit. I heard, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said that women especially are aware of what it means to have a historically constituted body. And I think that's
excellent. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that because when we talk about the ongoing negotiation of what is goth in general subcultural discourse, the history of what we understand goth to be is always part of that conversation. And I think that the past isn't necessarily static either, because we're sort of always reconstructing and modifying the events through our relationship with the present, and kind of like queering the past canon and that kind of thing with the present Goth experience. And that I like how I think those things are always enmeshed with each other. I just like that it's explicit in subcultural conversation. Yeah.
Well, I think they're always up for negotiation as well. I mean, where do we, particularly if we just take the notion of the past in terms of, what is Goth, where did it start? For each generation, there's a different answer. And that was one of the things that was really clear to me when I did not so much the surveys, but the interviews. So interviewing participants who were at the time of interview in their mid-50s, so they would now be 60, they were adamant that it was already occurring when punk was occurring. So it was emergent at the time of punk, and there was this slower, darker, grimmer version of punk that was coming out at the time, where people didn't want to be angry and abusive. They wanted to be, withdrawn and darker, And it came from, one of the ladies I spoke to spoke very eloquently about it emerging from the idea of, that sort of the Doors sort of heroin kind of scene in the 60s. And that holds, some truth. And it certainly held truth for her. So there's always a negotiation, there's always discussion. And I think different people have different views and from different sites of experience. Australian Goth is a very different thing in some ways to what is experienced where you are and what is experienced in the UK or Germany or anywhere else. So, I think it's very much an open negotiation, and it will continue.
Yeah.
And continue.
Yeah. Yep. Well, so let me ask about this then. I think this was mentioned already, the sort of the resistance to the mainstream thing.
Yep.
And because I wanted to ask if that came up, the idea of, because it's certainly in the sociological literature, the idea of not wanting to be readable by the mainstream. And I'm curious how that was sort of framed by the study participants.
Mostly folks gave a response that was, to summary, a huge amount of responses. They didn't want to be seen to follow blindly, is how I would sum it up. They didn't want to be seen to simply go into something because everyone else was doing it. Having said that, the idea of creativity came up repeatedly, and the ability to live creatively. So the idea that you are choosing, making choices, having agency, deciding in a detailed way that you've chosen something, that your life is dialed in with a moral and socio-aesthetic code. You've chosen something that suits you, not just, literally from your shoes up, but you've actually made some choices that reflect how you feel on the inside. So there were strong views offered around mindfulness around gender, sexuality, freedom of choice, just, generally being a sound human being. And this intrinsic notion of being able to make a statement about yourself without fear. So that conscious aspect of Goth where you're not fighting somebody, but at the same time, you're not frightened to stand your ground and say, this is who I am. So I think that was essentially what a lot of the respondents were saying. There were a number of participants who gave express examples of why they wanted to be Goth that were localized. So in America, there are a few people that said they didn't want to be, and excuse me for this, but they said they didn't want to be rednecks. In Australia, the example is bogans. I don't know if you're familiar with that word.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
yeah, so they didn't want to be bogans, which is, similar sort of thing. And in Britain, it was they didn't want to be chavs. So
chavs.
they're all very loaded terms, and they're not terms that I throw around without reason. They're terms that the participants chose, and they're the terms that they saw as being the most offensive. So that's what they were responding to.
those opinions are always funny to me because it sort of plays into that. I'm an individual and I want to be understood as a unique sort of nuanced person. And then I'm going to talk about this entire other group of people in completely reductionist terms.
Correct. Yeah. So, but that has to be taken into account. If that's how someone feels,
exactly.
Very well.
Yeah.
I include that information. What was really interesting, though, that most people did not use that sort of terminology. There were a handful of people that said that. And some of the people that use that sort of terminology to begin their comments then said, however, as I grew older, blah, blah, blah. And, I became more involved. But, maybe that was their first, inkling that they just didn't want to be like that. And, for some people in Australia, it was more outright and obvious. They didn't want to be sunburnt and be a surfy. It's really quite simple. It's a simple state of our climate. It's extremely warm here in summer. You get very sunburnt very quickly. We all live on the coast pretty much. There's absolutely no avoiding it. So if you don't want to live in that sort of sunburst country kind of way, it's nice to find a community that's happy to live in the shadows.
Yeah, I do think to give, I guess, a little bit of sympathy to those people using the offensive generalization or generalized terms for the rednecks or the chavs is, I think a lot of that does generally come from a place of trauma for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot of people are generalizing. This is a group that oppressed me, harmed, killed in some cases, as we've already mentioned.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And that's why it tends to be most acute with people who are young still, because that trauma is oftentimes still fresh. And then as we age into our subcultural expression, especially for those of us who stay within the subculture, it does tend to mute, because we learn perspective taking as we get older, and we learn why perhaps we were oppressed at the young age. That not to excuse it, there's definitely
the fear response recedes, doesn't it? And and look, I know as someone growing up in Perth, which if you look on a map, it's pretty much the most isolated city in the world, and the goth scene there was very much tied to the industrial scene. So we had quite a really strong goth industrial scene in Perth, but it did mean that when we had club nights, industrial music is really quite heavy. And so occasionally you would get heavy metal people coming along, or you would get this sort of quite rough, heavy masculine crowd coming in. And I was, more than once in a position where I felt very threatened. And, when I was very young, was in a position of being, stuck in a ruckus at a club. And it was scary. It was really, really scary. But I also was able to sort of stand back from it relatively quickly, I think, and go, well, hang on, that wasn't because it was me. It was just them being angry. So I think a lot of people make that distinction relatively quickly. But yeah, I totally understand the fear response.
All right, well, let's talk about something completely different. I have no good segue.
My cats?
I do actually, yes. Let's hear about your cats. What are their names?
Cairo, Leopold, and Dorian.
Oh my God, I love it. I love it. Cats are important on this podcast, so thank you for sharing that information. Yeah, so to kind of talk about fashion for a bit here, I kind of have a two-part question, because I've seen in other academic articles and papers, people make the point that, and I guess this kind of speaks to the abstraction we were talking about with other groups, but some authors have made the point that goth implicitly sets itself apart from the mainstream, or from mainstream youth culture with its fashion, and it's sort of presented as an obvious thing. But I tend to feel like it amalgamates and abstracts other youth cultures. So I had a couple questions around that. Sort of the first one, I guess, would be, essentially, what is it that sets Goth apart stylistically from other subcultures when there is kind of a heterogeneity or diversity of styles in those groups?
So in terms of talking about heterogeneity and the mainstream and Goth culture, I think for Goth, dread is where Goths have got their cultural capital. It's not necessarily their it's not what they're wearing, it's their attitude, it's the way they carry themselves. So it's that dark beauty or gothness that people embrace that sets them apart in a way that is more unsettling for the mainstream. Now, I don't think Goths are completely outside the mainstream at all. And I think, as many, many people have demonstrated, it's very, very simple to put on a pair of jeans and a white T-shirt and fit back in if you really want to. I think what is different is that Goths are able to move across those spectrums of being. And as I've mentioned in my paper, Grant McCracken, who writes a fantastic book called Plenitude and the Culture of Commotion, he talks about the idea of many, many cultures all existing at once, and the idea of people interchanging and moving and shifting around all at once. So there's this plenitude of everything happening all at once, and people can move in and out of cultural styles and fitting within their culture at the same time as fitting within another culture. So you might be a Goth, you might also be a Trekkie. You might be a Goth, you might also be a car fanatic. You might be a Goth, you might be a dentist. You know, it's not like you're just one thing. I think in terms of the way you look, though, it's very, very specific. And clearly the black clothing is a telltale sign. I don't think anyone's going to say that Goth has any other telltale sign rather than its black clothing. However, then you start to think about, well, hang on, recently we've had pastel Goths. We've had all sorts of interesting things come out of the woodwork. And that is a new form of what people are calling Goth, whether we all agree that that is part of the normal Goth culture or not. And I'm saying normal because one of the common responses from participants was that that's not normal for Goths to wear pastel colours. Now, it may not have been normal in the 80s or the 90s or the 2000s, but maybe it will be this year or next year. So Goth is always evolving. We don't know what the primary canon of Goth will be next year, but we know what it is right now, and it's black clothing. I mean, that's our fundamental. But I think one of the things that sets us apart from dread is our footwear. So if you look at, I think I spoke about this on the last time I was on your program. If you're sitting on a train or you're sitting on a car or something, and people walk past and you can only see their feet, you can always tell when a Goth walks past. I mean, there is no denying it. The shoe factor is huge. You know, you can tell almost instantly what the rest of the person is going to look like just from their shoes. And it's fascinating to me that the research data correlates with that. So when you look at what people say is their favourite shoe type, and then you look at what else they wear, so you match up if people prefer the Victorian Goth look, they've got the Victorian Goth boots, they've got the long floaty clothing, they've got the corsets, all that sort of stuff. That is what defines Goth to most people, is that those core types of Goth. So there are subsets of the Goth culture that are undeniably, our standard format, if you like. But it's that dark beauty and that use of dread that makes us so unlikely to fit in to mainstream. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I like that. Yeah, I was waiting to see if Trey had any thoughts.
I actually had a comment on something you were talking about earlier when you were referring to the Grant McCracken and his concept of plenitude in the book. You were talking about the concept of plenitude being this diversity of multiple different subcultures or groupings or however you want to term them, that people are freely moving in and out. I'm curious if his book brings up concepts of intersectionality or code switching in relation to that, as well as very similar terms in our diversity discussion rather than in a subcultural context so much. But they definitely are expressions of how people navigate that existence within multiple groupings and or having to move from one to another freely when they don't necessarily freely overlap.
Yeah, he does talk about it to some extent. The book was written in 1997, so it is
a little
quite
bit
old.
Before that conversation really started.
That's right. Yeah, so it is an old text, and I make no apologies for that, because I still think it's a really fabulous starting point to consider. And it talks about subcultures in a way that I don't think any other sociological text had done to that point. And I think it's really ahead of its time, because it starts talking about the use of the internet and how it may provide subcultures with this new platform. And I think it's so prescient, because it just shows, it basically spells out exactly how subcultures went ahead and used the internet to create new cultures and new communities online. Mm-hmm. And I think it's absolutely fascinating how McCracken was able to see that and tap into that idea of it's much more than just the way they look. It's how they think, it's how they feel, it's what they read, it's what they see, and how they transmit those thoughts between different communities and different interests all at the same time. So he talks about Ren Fair people as well, which I find really fascinating. We don't have that culture here in Australia so much, being, very young country, as it were, from a colonial perspective, mm-hmm. Which is very tricky in itself, and another topic I'd like to discuss some other time. But mm-hmm. There's this idea that there's a battle line between people who are recreationist, Victorian or medieval costumiers, and then you've got the goths who are just there for, they're wearing the costumes, but they're not, or they're wearing the outfits, but they're not, adhering to the true sense of the correct costumes, as it were. So then you've got this dichotomy of, well, are you a recreationist, or are you a recreationist? There's all those sorts of cross pollinations that occur as well, and I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely have a strong feeling about that too, because I've always, at least in America, we do have Ren fairs and stuff, but we also have the SCA, or the Society for Creative Anachronism. And yes. One of the things that I've always thought of as the distinguishing factor between those two is people who attend a Ren fair are more the recreationists.
Yes.
I was just at the Ren fair, and we did have a couple of away mission folks visiting the Renaissance era. And that's very accepted at Ren fairs, which is why I much more enjoy going to a Ren fair than to an SCA event, because I find the SCA events, most of the attendees there are very focused on the concept of medieval recreation, and they get really agitated when they see somebody with like zippers and inappropriate pockets and other things like that seem just like, really?
Isn't that fascinating though? I mean, in this day and age, I mean, it's a whole nother topic really, but I just find that absolutely wonderful, and the dedication that must take. Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, I do have a soft spot for people who show up to those in Star Trek outfits. So,
Yes.
Anyway, probably moving on from that.
This is not the Star Trek
to a degree, that's almost a celebration of what Goth kind of embraces, which is the outsider. Yes. And in something like a Ren fair, where the normative behavior is dressing up in Renaissance clothing,
that's right. Yeah.
Traditional, romantic Goth garb isn't really an outsider look, but coming as a red shirt, that's an outsider look.
Yes.
And as a Goth,
that's really sticking it to them. Yeah.
Coming from the outsider perspective of an embrace of the outsider. That's definitely something that we can empathize and enjoy.
Yeah, and again, it's that dark humor of, it's the fatalism of, I know I'm going to die, but I'm here anyway. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it.
There was an interesting comment on our last episode talking about or I guess arguing that there is no original Goth style. And if you take any given item, you can trace it back to other communities and cultures. So then they were sort of commenting on the common complaint among Goths that oh, you can't tell who's a Goth anymore because everybody's stealing from our fashion, our ephemera. So they were saying, like, you shouldn't have that sense of ownership because it's not original. And I thought that was interesting in a sense, because with the shoes, pointy shoes have been used since, I think, medieval times. And, indigenous people had big fluffy hair and body modifications, that kind of thing. But, the way that the emphasis I try and place on, from my own perspective on fashion, is that for Goth specifically, we're kind of taking ephemera from past communities and cultures and modifying it and incorporating it into a performance of Goth. Yes. But the emphasis I try and place when thinking about these things is the fact that even the SCA kind of thing, it's not happening in a vacuum, and that those material objects we use are kind of established established by the organisms around us, the environment, the sort of like, history, politics, concepts, bundles of practices, bodies in motion, that kind of thing. All of these constituent elements are enmeshed to kind of enact Goth, is what I like to say. I was reading a book called Hebdige and Subculture in the 21st Century, which is a really interesting book. Have you ever read it?
It's a good book. Yep.
Yeah, so they were talking about a different way, or a similar way of looking at signs and symbols when Hebdige was talking about, like, what I guess in postmodern studies became known as free-floating signifiers.
Yep.
Although I think that had been used by, like, whoever, was it Derrida or somebody? Anyway, basically, as I understand it, free-floating signifiers mean that there's no external referent. The sign becomes its own referent. So I think Hebdige was talking about, like, the punk use of safety pins being used in, like, non-traditional ways, and so they take on new meanings that. That's right. So that
bricolage of history,
yeah, which sounded kind of similar to Plenitude to me. I like the idea of a multiplicity of meaning around different objects and things and ways of being. The thing with the free-floating signs, though, is it, I think, in semiotics specifically, it can. Sorry, thank you for indulging me. Sometimes I ramble.
No, please do.
Is that because it has a focus on meaning, and I think it kind of divorced that from those networks. I guess ontological networks, or I guess that's how I would say it.
Yep.
The practices of the actors and the kind of focusing on the content of the object and removing it from
the source material.
Like in the social and exactly.
An artifact without context.
Yeah, it's kind of like an epistemic perspective, but I do like that idea of this multiplicity of being instead of a more like essentialist sort of view, I guess.
I think one of the things with the safety pin, if we take that example for a second, I think safety pins are a great example of, like, sort of the postage stamp sort of analogy of a signpost of style. Like, you can take a safety pin and send it away, and everyone can wear it in different ways, and it becomes sort of this idea of, a little bit punk, a little bit this, a little bit that. And can also reference, kilts. People, the Scottish people and the Celtic people wear the giant safety pins on their kilts.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it sort of has almost no meaning, kind of. I think that's kind of fair. But when you get into the weeds a bit with things like people using indigenous tribes sort of imagery, like I'm thinking here about the cult and their use of Sioux Indian imagery, and Susie Sue's name in itself is a little bit dodgy, I would argue. This use of things that are not without meaning and not without cultural significance, I think then you start sort of having to pause and go, well, actually, are we doing a disservice to the source material here or the culture?
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing a disservice to ourselves by perpetuating it? I think there are other things like, okay, bats, ravens, all that sort of thing. I think they're pretty safe. I think we're all going to be pretty safe from those. But I think you have to really be cautious about even, the use of sugar skulls and
I was just going to talk about the sugar skulls. Mm.
I personally try not to include those. I don't have them in my house. I don't use them. It's not part of my culture. I find them a little bit unsettling to see in the shops, and I find it a little bit distasteful, to be honest, to see people sort of gobbling those up at Halloween, because they're just they're really meaningful to the culture where they came from. I don't think that's without meaning, and I think that's something we should be awfully careful of. I don't think that's without significance. So that's how I would sort of counter that discussion is, yes, sometimes it's a bricolage of free things that are safety pins and such, but other times, maybe take your time and consider whether that is the safest and most wise choice.
Yeah, the discussion around cultural appropriation and things like that is really a thorny one. It's not, I don't see it that heavily hit in the goth subculture because we do tend to gravitate around sort of the general purpose, bats and spiders and ravens and very naturalistic. It does get somewhat questionable when you start seeing the ankhs and to degree the crosses, Thor's hammers, other things from pagan and other religious identities. And then there was, like you mentioned, the cult. There has been, and Susie, there has been some appropriation of Native American iconography. But I would say on the whole, in the majority, goth seems to gravitate more towards the more general purpose aesthetics. The skulls and things that are universal. There's not necessarily signs of death in every culture, but they're at least a universal thing that is not unique to a specific culture, and we aren't co-opting that meaning for a colonialized purpose. But it is something we need to continually engage upon. It is, but does mean that we can't sit on our laurels, and we do have to confront it when it does arise. We can't have our sort of feel like we have moral agency because we're good in most things, that it's okay to be bad every once in a while. I was like, no, it's always bad to be bad. Even if you're good in other ways, it's still bad to be bad. So try to address those when they do come up. Or I guess more licensing is mercifully rare, though.
I think that's something that's quite remarkable. And given punk's history of the use of swastikas and other really horrendous imagery, I think actually we've been incredibly lucky as a culture not to embrace that use. And the industrial side of the coin is really littered with some really questionable iconography and language and
in industrial ideologically, at least originally, based on what Genesis liked to talk about with his industrial records concept, was very much along the same lines as punk, where it was about being aggressively at something.
That's right. Yeah.
It was being offensive for the point of being offensive, whereas we already discussed, goth pulled away from that aspect of the punk and post-punk subculture to, we just want to be ourselves and find a community, and we're not really planning on sticking it to anybody. But by that same token, we are individuals, and we're not going to kowtow, and we're not going to let you dictate what is appropriate in our presentation. But we're not doing it to offend you explicitly, though you may end up being offended. But that's not the goal.
And I also think because we're not seeking any kind of sort of admiration necessarily, or we're not looking to be welcomed into the mainstream. Like, we're not on the outside trying to get back in. There's no conflict. I think the punk movement, and this is something I think is overlooked, the punk movement was really struggling to be seen as, in England particularly, not so much in America, I would argue, but in the UK, very much an underclass with very little socioeconomic power that were desperately trying to find a way to get out of their poverty and, their situation. And, that's not the case for the largely white middle-class goth community, and that is borne out in the data. So, yeah.
That's interesting.
It's a different community.
It's interesting. Yeah, I do talk on this podcast a lot about class consciousness and leftist ideologies, but I think in general, you're right. It does, and I don't know, I might have a biased algorithm as well, because I tend to see the minority goths and the whoever, communist goths or whatever, talking about those kinds of things. But yeah, you have a much larger data set than I do. But it's interesting. It's all contextual, and these working with and through these socio-material networks and all that kind of thing.
Look, I'm not saying that it's all white middle class by any means. I'm just saying that there's a huge number of, certainly in the early days, there was an enormous overrepresentation of white middle class people having access to goth music and goth clubs and so forth. Now I think it's changed radically, but in the early days, and these are the people that I've interviewed who are now, in their 50s, 40s, 50s, 60s, it was actually more difficult than I expected to interview people of different ethnicities in Australia. So not so much overseas, but in Australia, we're very small, we're a little place.
And I mean, punk was all about, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, from the stuff I've read of the era of the emergence of goth, there was a preponderance of not wealthy, but definitely the comfortable college-bound art student core of the movement, rather than the very blue-collar, hand-to-mouth, working-class roots of punk that weren't going to college. They were inner-city youth struggling to find an identity while also struggling to survive, where a lot of goths, sure, they lived in squats and things like that, but it was a choice usually. It felt more like slumming than the necessity.
Yes, exactly. And it was a bit of excitement maybe for some, not all, but for some.
Yeah, I think I read a lot of the post-punk artists came out of the welfare system in Britain, and they had the ability to go to an art college for completely paid for a number of years, and then just only work on their art and create music or whatever they were into, which is a very different situation. And
I can, I'm one of those people. I went to art school. I did a fine art degree. I got a Bachelor in Fine Arts, and then I did a design degree. And I am literally one of those people. I was able to have the benefit of a country that allowed me to go to university and be an artist. I did work straight away, but the difference is I had the freedom of choice, and I was able to make those decisions on my own, and I didn't have a burden of debt. I didn't have a burden of fear or class or, deprivation or social pressure on me to do other things. So, and I also didn't have children or any kind of familial pressures. So they're major, major life events that shape people's ways of being and choices. So, not everyone gets those privileges, and I'm very aware of that.
Yeah. That should be how the system works for everyone, but that's a different conversation anyway.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much. My brain is buzzing. There's so many things to talk about.
Sorry. I'm very happy to come back again. We can do another chat some of the time.
I guess I should ask, because we did talk about and around Plenitude. I wanted to ask if you could talk about Socio-Aesthetic. You kind of gave a short introduction to that, but if you can kind of elaborate, because that's a core element to your article, at least.
In my thesis, which hasn't yet been published, but I am hoping to publish as a book, So, yeah, the main finding that came out of all of the research was the idea that Goth forms this kind of socio-aesthetic framework around which people form their lives. And it's more than just, as we've discussed in detail already, it's more than just putting on clothes or choosing shoes or choosing music and all that sort of thing. It's an entire way of being. It forms your social groups. It allows you to choose and design the way you live. And it allows people to create networks online, in person, and within your own life. So it forms, in some ways, it forms a structure that in previous generations maybe, and I hesitate to use this word, but maybe a structure that religion would have taken, or perhaps in some other instances, other philosophies may have filled that space. But I think to use the word socio-aesthetic, it's socio-aesthetics is the notion of underpinning a lifestyle notion. So it's the way of finding constancy in your life and community as opposed to just choosing a style. So it's got a deeper philosophical meaning for people, and it's got an aesthetic basis to it, but it also takes into account the idea of relationships, friendship circles, the idea that you can travel and be mobile. It gives you flexibility of choice and it gives you agency. So they're really big things in terms of youth development. So people coming into the goth scene don't have to make life choices like that, okay, this is what I'm going to be and it's never going to change. They can make a choice that allows them a path into a community and find belonging, but then they can move along and find different ways of being. And that may radically change over time. It may do full circles. It may go back to being what it was when they started. And it allows for many, many branchings off into, they might try goth industrial, they might try metal, they might try, all sorts of different things. I think where this notion might be challenging for some people is in recent times, aesthetic has taken on a new sort of linguistic parlance, which I hadn't really noticed until recently. People are using aesthetic online to sort of talk about their general look. So I think that's interesting because when I started writing this thesis, it was almost an unused phrase. So it's either timely or it's going to confuse matters. I'm not sure which. But I think, to describe goth as being this socio-aesthetic framework made a lot of sense. One of the questions, the first question I think it was in the surveys was, how would you describe goth? People described it as a community, as an aesthetic choice, as a style. And when you sort of mush all those things together, you end up with the idea of it being social plus look, which is socio-aesthetic. So that's how we end up there.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think distinguishing yourself isn't static across time, like you were kind of talking about.
Right,
You react and change in obvious ways, subtle ways, from moment to moment, depending on where you are, who you're interacting with, that kind of thing. You mentioned the use of aesthetic online, and that was another thing I wanted to ask about, was the role that internet plays in goth identity and how you see that working, or how respondents talked about that.
This is actually a really huge question, and when I was halfway through doing my sorry, it is, when I was halfway through doing my thesis, one of my examiners said to me, are you writing about the internet or are you writing about the internet's role with the participants? And I was like, that's a really good question, because it became really clear that the internet had become such a fundamental aspect of how goth culture had been perpetuated since the 90s that I think it's arguable, I mean, it can't be tested, but it's arguable that without the internet, goth may have just sort of retained itself within its sites of experience. So where you are, where I am, where whoever else is, and not interacted beyond being those sort of mail order, video lists that I talked about early on. It's the invention of the internet that it's allowed everyone to suddenly become a true community, and the idea that it provides not just a basis for sharing ideas and products, but also music and fundamental notions of, am I okay? That idea that you couldn't, if you were in a small town, for instance, in Australia, you grew up, as I said, Perth's very isolated, but if you grew up in somewhere like Kalgoorlie in Perth, which is 200 kilometres outside Perth, which is even more isolated, you may not have a single other person within 100 kilometres of you who looks like you or listens to sounds that you like, and you might be like, well, am I weird? Am I not right? What's the story with me? To be able to go online and find thousands of other people that are virtually, in sync with you immediately is extraordinary, and not something that we are really easily able to describe to the people emerging now in the scene. I hate to sound like an ancient person, but in my day, it was, you knew about 5 or 6, maybe 10 people in the true goth scene, and then you knew maybe 20 or 30 people in the alternative goth industrial scene around you, total in your area.
Yeah.
And then some hangers on, whatever, other people that were from, like scene. But it was extremely unlikely that you would ever have a proper conversation with, someone like yourself or someone from the UK or someone from Russia. It would just simply never happen. It was extremely unlikely. We'd write letters. There was a section in the back of the NME new press where you could get pen pals from overseas, and I had a pen pal in the UK who I wrote to for many years, and we eventually did meet, but that was, when we were in our 40s.
I love that.
It was that kind of lifestyle that was so isolated from the day-to-day. It was a special event rather than a day-to-day event. So the invention of the internet has provided a lifestyle as opposed to a leisure style. So goth used to be, you'd go clubbing on the weekend, you'd go shopping, you'd buy some albums, you'd maybe go thrifting and go to op shops and do some sewing or whatever and make yourself an outfit, or maybe if you're really lucky, get some dog mums or something. And then you'd either go back to work or go back to school or go back to uni during the week. The difference is now it's every moment of every day. It's on your phone. It's right there. So it is so intrinsic to the culture now. It's absolutely, it's just fundamentally stitched in. It cannot be undone. So yeah, it's it's a huge question.
It is, yeah, it really is.
So one thing that I find interesting, just looking at the history of the goth subculture and subcultures in general coming out of the 70s and 80s especially, is even though they didn't have the internet until getting into the 90s, they kind of made their own internet even at that time. I mean, you are an exemplar of that yourself with the pen pal thing and your VHS.
Oh, but it was so slow.
It is very slow. There is definitely, I'm not going to say the internet was not a boon, but it was not, I don't feel it was quite this unique panacea, because we had zines, we had tape trading, we had the pen pal concepts and things like that. So we had a very slow analog version of what then became the internet. But we kind of, even though it didn't exist in anything other than research and educational spaces in that era, the need for that sort of communication and that sort of community outside of the immediate local community existed, and they found ways to implement it.
I agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you in the sense that it was there. I guess what I'm saying is and in my experience, in the experience of certainly Australian participants, it was not sufficient. And a lot of the scene here died out early because it didn't have the connections, it didn't have the patrons, or people didn't know that it existed. And a lot of clubs simply didn't run because people didn't know they were running, because there was no way to advertise them, or beyond, the existing media, that if you didn't know that media existed, if you didn't have the street press, or you didn't see the ads in local shops, and you didn't know those shops existed, then you didn't know. You were cut out of that media cycle. Whereas now it's much more intrinsic to daily life, and you get pushed, you get a lot more community involvement. It's much more, it's more fast paced. Whereas,
yes. It's real time.
Yeah, and I think the notion that the mail order catalogues were enough for an Australian audience is misleading, in that I'm still waiting for a T-shirt, and I'm still waiting for a VHS from 1991. So, it wasn't sufficient for us. It was a really slow process.
Yeah, and there's an expression of privilege as an American from my perspective as well, being, not necessarily the birthplace, but one of the largest Goth communities historically. So it's always been available. So I never really had to use the internet, which is why I don't have the same perspective, because I don't really use the internet for my experience in Goth. I mean, I'm online, sure, and I follow a couple of Goth YouTubers, but that's relatively recent in my existence. Right. Obviously being on the podcast, but again, only been for the past several years. Whereas starting from the mid 90s, when I was getting into Goth initially, I found trying to get things on the internet to be frustrating. I mean, I was a net goth early on, so I was in the Usenet and alt Gothic and all that stuff. Yeah. And I found that to be an interesting community, but it wasn't necessarily, it was a supplemental community for me.
Okay.
Something to do as sort of a fun, not a lifeline. So that's my privilege.
Right. So here we had listings for every state in Australia and what you could find in each state, literally with maps and rundowns of shops and all that sort of thing, because it was so hard to find anything in Australia. It was so hard to find a shop that sold anything with anything Goth in it whatsoever, that it became this sort of Bible, and the forums and the user groups online would, we'd update each other on, where things were open or not open, and, this place is selling albums, this place is selling whatever. And it was so important when it first started, and we were really early adopters of those Usenet groups and messaging forums and so on. So it was interesting. And again, that privilege, it was a lot of university students, it was a lot of people in a position of privilege and lucky. They were lucky people. They weren't people who were struggling.
Yeah. The funny / frustrating thing from my perspective along the same lines is we also have directories of state by state events happening. Yeah. But most of the ones I can find are like 10 to 15 years out of date. I'll go to these sites and like, I'm going to be visiting Austin. What's the local scene?
Took that over.
It did, but it's harder to find it unless
City
you know.
Is a good resource. I think. That's the only one I know of. But
that's disappointing.
I've gone to some of the general sort of Goth, directories that are ostensibly a single web page that lists events and club things from various states, and I'll go to that page. I'm like, I'm going to be in Florida. What are the things other than the castle in Florida?
Club night's in 2016.
And not even 2016, 2006 or 99. I mean, there's just, you look at them and it was like last updated 10 years ago. And you try to find Facebook and you try to look up the names in various things. And it's hard because of how much information is online to sort of suss out the actual accurate stuff, because we don't have a good, or at least I've always struggled to find a good central location.
Yeah.
I always have to reach out to people I happen to know, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, in my local scene, blah."
There was just a kind of funny story about that. My first experience, or what would have been my first experience going to a goth club when I turned 18, because I didn't have, at that point, I didn't have friends I could ask about what there was available. And so I found a listing online for local area goth clubs, and most of them were in Chicago. There was one that was in the suburbs. And so I planned this whole day and night around going to this event, which was listed as at this date. Here's a phone number. Here's the address.
Oh.
And like I got all dressed up. My girlfriend at the time did, my best friend. And we decided like, well, we should call just to double check everything. And so I called that night before we left, and it was, it had become just like a generic office building. And they were very perplexed about me asking for, I can't remember the goth club name, but it was really disappointing because it didn't exist and nobody updated the website, right? So I didn't know.
Oh, that's sad.
Well, let me move from one giant question to another giant question, which I was just curious because there's so much literature. Well, maybe not so much. There's some literature about this that I found interesting. But I wanted to give you some space to talk about what you learned around the endurance of goth identity later into life and how that might change or stay the same based on age.
Yeah. Okay. So that is a really
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a big one. I think the biggest thing I got out of people's responses, as opposed to what, so rather than talking about the literature and so on and what other people have said, I would prefer to talk about what the respondents actually said in their questionnaires and interviews. And I think what was most common was that as a long-term identity framework, so as a socio-aesthetic framework, people found goth really forgiving, and they found it a mode of engagement that allows you to be either spectacular or everyday or unusual, or it allows you to be what you need to be day to day. So it has a spectrum of identity that I think is overlooked by a lot of researchers. And I think in texts there's always this assumption that everyone's going to be that uber goth that you see in festival posters and so on, that has got every single accoutrement that you can imagine. And that's fantastic, and we've all had that moment, but I think most people on any given day are not dressed that spectacularly, and I think that is what is fundamental to goth identity. It is flexible. It does allow you to age. It does allow you to find different ways of being. It allows you to relax the rules, as it were, or the tenets of goth, and incorporate all sorts of iterations of goth that you didn't think would ever happen. I think a great example of that is in Whitby. The festival obviously itself is fantastic, but the idea that they have a goth football team at Whitby, I find is staggering. The first time I went to the festival, I actually didn't really grasp that it was really a football team. I thought it was sort of a joke, and then I was like, they are actually a football team. I see. Okay. And to me, if you told me when I was 15, 16 that they were going to have a football team at Whitby, I would just be like, there's no way I would have believed that was real. But it's an important part of life. So when you've got kids, you've got a community, you're living in a seaside town or near a seaside town, and an important part of that town's life cycle is weekend football. Of course, you want to be part of that, but you want to be part of it on your terms. So that idea that you can be fluid in your expression of your identity and still be authentic is incredibly powerful. So I think that's where the idea of styles of life or species of social life, which is what McCracken calls it, so that idea of little cultures or styles of life within and outside the mainstream, I think that's where the value of Goth can be seen both from within the culture and from outside researchers looking in. So I think the endurance also and the success of Goth is because of that. We're not definable. We're not, there is no set formula. You can't actually write down exactly what Goth is. And that's why everyone asks the question over and over and over again, because there isn't a set answer.
Mm-hmm.
You can show up wearing probably 15 different outfits. You've probably got
Mm-hmm.
15 different outfits in your wardrobe. And you would say they were all Goth, and you'd be
Mm-hmm.
completely correct.
Mm-hmm. But
they're all for different moments in life, and that's what gives you that freedom and success. So I think that's it's that simultaneity of being rooted in the past, in the present, and the future, all at once. That fluidity of it's completely out of time. It's that anachronous sense of existing all at once. It's an incredibly powerful sense of belonging. It's almost like you've created a little bubble around yourself and you're untouchable because you've made a choice that is going to be constant, and only you can change it. And I think that's something that a lot of research has sort of skirted around a bit. There's a lot of focus on the spectacularity of Goth culture and aging spectacularly, and continuing this idea of being sort of rebellious and still crimping your hair when you're 50 and how they're so rebellious. I don't know that that's so relevant these days. I think it's more a matter of, okay, well, maybe we are ignoring the conventional strictures of later stages of life, and maybe we're not wearing slippers and grey cardigans, but that's okay too, because no one set those limits for us. We've just decided what our limits are, and we're going to continue to work within them. So that's a powerful form of agency, and I think that's probably the biggest thing I took out of what people told me when I was interviewing them.
I remember the first time, I think this was on a YouTube video, the first time I watched a video about Whitby Goth Weekend, and at the end of it they had a section about the football team, and in my sort of young naivete I thought, who are these posers? Goths don't play sports. What's happening here? Yeah, I just thought that was funny. I did want to ask, well, I had a couple thoughts, but I wanted to ask, because you've used the word a couple times.
Before you ask, can I just make a quick statement?
Yeah.
I'm just reiterating something again that I think I've commented on before, but I think this idea that the welcoming of the wide, diverse plurality of different ways of being into Goth spaces is both our strength and also why Goth is so maddening to sociological researchers, or just any researchers from the outside using traditional tools of outside observation to get a grasp on a culture, because Goth isn't so much a proscriptive culture like a lot of others are, where you can look at, okay, what do they allow, what do they not allow, and that helps define the culture. Where we're more just really, when we talk about cultural spaces and gatherings and happenings, we want people who are interesting and people who are safe. And beyond that, I mean, it's nice to have the shared interests, and we engage more when they have shared interests, but as long as they meet those two criteria, they're generally welcome at our spaces. But coming from the outside, that means you're going to be seeing people of all kinds of different types of being and experiencing, a socio-aesthetic appearance from the outside that is at odds with what actual individuals who are within the scene will express as what's important, which is why you have to do what you did, get detailed internal discussions and survey responses with more than just yes no's, with actual lived experiences written long form that you can then parse out to get a better understanding of, not everything that is at a Goth themed event is part of the subculture as a core, but if you talk to
but
the
it might
people,
still
you'll
have
get
emotional value. Yeah,
it'll still have emotional value. It'll still it's part of what makes the event, and that's what makes the people who are goth value going to it, because we like the plurality, we like seeing the variance. But we are, we're also, like I would mention, coming from places of trauma on occasion. That's why that our safe is an important consideration.
Yes,
There are people who, that's also, I think, where our disdain or expressed disdain for the mainstream is, because towing the line of sort of a sense of normalcy, whatever that happens to be, is to a degree a threat signal.
Yes,
From an outsider subculture. So it's just, I think that's both our key to our longevity and the key to why we're such a maddening study subject as a subculture.
And why it's so hard to actually define what goth is. And in fact, the final line, hang on, I'll grab it so that I read it correctly. The final line of my thesis actually reads, "The perennial question of what goth is may never be definitively answered, yet data presented here has demonstrated that goths just know it exists."
I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it.
That's cute.
Yeah.
The old porn and obscenity debate.
Yeah. Because fundamentally that is what almost everyone said. Like, you can meet someone who is in a uniform at work, and their hair's tied back or they're wearing a hat and you can't see anything and they've got no makeup on and and you're like, no, there's something about you. There's just something about you. And then all of a sudden you're talking about bands and you're talking about where, they went on holiday and, you're like, oh my God. And you connect. There's this really interesting connection that occurs that, it's that safety, finding safety with people and clicking. It's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have so many thoughts about. Well, I don't have the time. I did.
Sorry.
I did. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's just one of those you could endlessly spiral off into many different metaphysical, ontological, whatever.
It's very hard. Go forever. Yeah.
I did want to ask though, because you mentioned this a couple times, and I like to hear what your take on this is, because you've said the word authentic. And in my mind, that's this sort of essentialist individualism, that there's an immutable core essence of a thing, and you're judged to be authentic based on something that's irreducible, I guess. But I want to know what you mean by authentic and sort of being fluid and authentic at the same time.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so when I say authentic, what I guess I'm saying is authentic to myself, being honest about what I'm presenting, and I'm not hiding behind, for instance, I'm not hiding behind terminology when I talk. I've been very straightforward in my terminology all through my research, and I've made it really clear to people what my position is, and I haven't tried to, prejudge or twist what my research has been. But also in terms of the responses, if people have used particular terminology or they've said certain things or they've held views, I have represented those views to the best of my ability and held those with a degree of, I guess I've tried to be as fair
respect
with those as and it's not even respect. It's almost like I'm sure there's a better way of phrasing this, but I feel like I have to honour what has been entrusted to me, even if I don't agree with it. So I'm upholding people's right to have a view. And because there's such a wealth of data from this project, I cannot possibly publish all of it, and I cannot give every single person's view an airing because there's simply too much. But where there is a bulk of a view, so for instance, 90-something% of people said that, goth is linked to music, it's linked to black and dark colours and, dark beauty. I think that therefore is authentic. I think they're authentic views of what Goth is based on. So they're things that I've taken forward as being, if you like, the tenets or the fundamentals of Goth. So I'm being driven by what the data is telling me. I'm not saying, well, personally, I think the Sisters of Mercy is authentic. So there you go. That's my view. No, that's not what's happening. So, I'm being as honest and straightforward as I can be, and I'm making sure that as much as possible people are represented, and where someone has given an outsider view that I think is worth hearing, or they've given a view that I think is important to the discussion, I have included it. And I would say in that there are a couple of views that I think need to be given further light, and one of those is the fact, as we discussed earlier, there is an enormous amount of cultural appropriation that happens in Goth, and some of it is fine. Some of it, I think, probably could do with a bit more investigation. And I think in Australia, we haven't ever really discussed the notion of colonialism and how it might look. And that's a much bigger topic than we've got time for today. But I would just like to say that one of the people I spoke to is of Aboriginal descent, and they commented to me that they felt threatened by Goths originally because, we had all these white faces and, was it a stand against Black people? And I was so shocked and so hurt and just so terrified that would be their response. Like, I just felt terrible. And I was like, no, absolutely not. It was like, oh my God, if that's what people are thinking, I have to deal with that, I have to face that. So this idea that Goth could be, in a sense, racist or projecting a racist image because of whiteface.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, that warrants further investigation or discussion. So
yeah.
I know we
aren't innocent of it either. I mean, it's not the meaning behind it, but there definitely are people, as we've discussed on several occasions on this show, that do believe Goth is for whites because they can only do the white-faced. And you're right, it is definitely not. We all die, and the aesthetic is there. Not everybody gets pale when they die, but that's still that's the aesthetic.
Well, I mean, I've heard Black Goths talk about how I can't remember the specific places they were in, but talk about how they felt like Goth spaces weren't for them, and that's their experience of that. And I think in America, at least I can't speak for obviously imperialism and colonialism exists all over, but in America, I think if you're a white person, you're more or less on a scale of how racist are you, and that's something that I think needs to be, that the privilege and the decolonizing needs to be examined as part of the conversation in the Goth community. And I think more of that has been happening, which I've been happy to see, but that's certainly, another area.
It's not my area of expertise, but I would love to see someone who is really well-versed in that area. In fact, I'd absolutely love to, if anyone is interested, I would love to be involved in something like that. My study covered 43 countries, most of which were European, and it was limited to people who spoke English. So, which was unfortunate because I would love to have involved a greater portion of people from Europe that didn't speak English, but I couldn't, spread myself thinner, as it were, and my limited German wasn't going to cover me on that one, I'm afraid. So 43 countries was pretty good, but there wasn't. It was only in English. So that's another limitation that could be addressed as well.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to decide if I start another thought or if I say it's time to wrap up. And I think probably it's been a couple hours. I think probably is a good point, because we're never going to stop.
Well, as I warned you, I could probably talk all day. So
that's all of us. So
Can I make one quick comment
just
before you go? Because I just did want to. You asked me about #Goth.
Oh yeah, I forgot. Yes.
I actually wanted, and I forgive me, this is a bit of a thank you to you as well. not only was hashtag Goth a sort of a bit of a surprise package for me, because, you know, in my day, people just didn't even admit that they were Goths, but now people actually use hashtag Goth. But also having people like yourself and other podcasts and groups and online personalities using social media to promote Goth meant that this study was able to reach over 2,000 people, and it was able to get participants from all over the world. So, you know, that's really significant. So I'm hugely grateful to you for that. You were certainly a part of that. And I think it is massively important that that's acknowledged. So thank you. I just wanted to mention that.
Oh, wow. I really appreciate that. Yeah. And obviously your research meant a lot to myself and the community. And it's really, you know, I mean, goes back to that sort of the way that the internet constitutes subculture to some degree, because doing the podcast has been really humbling, but it's enabled me to connect with people I never would have connected with and make friends and create networks that wouldn't have existed across borders, right? Obviously you're in Australia, but we've talked to somebody from Botswana, Costa Rica, Mexico, Germany, but like Ireland.
Wonderful, yeah.
Right. And we're able to hear stories from people's experiences in the 80s and 90s. And it's really incredible to be a part of that, but also just to recognize that this is all plays a role in the formation and like negotiation of our understanding of Goth. And yeah, I did see, I wouldn't lie if I didn't say that I squealed a bit when I saw the Belfry mentioned in the article.
Yep, I saw that delightful. Too. It was very nice.
No, genuinely, I was really thankful for your exposure. That it was such good timing that when you gave it some light, and there were a couple of other people as well that put it up on their sites and got it running, and it was just one of those things that it hit the right people at the right time, and it got great exposure, and I was able to get a great cohort of participants who all did a fantastic service to their community. So I was so grateful. And can I also say thank you to any of your listeners who did participate, because the responses were absolutely awesome. And there was only one person out of, I think in the end there were about 3,500 people that commenced the survey. There were over 2,000 that completed every single question. So they're the ones that are included in the data. But there was only one person that sent in a negative comment. So
wow,
I think that's pretty amazing.
That is.
I think that's also a really good snapshot of what kind of people this community has. I think that's really incredible.
I hope that wasn't.
I was expecting all sorts of
Cemetery
things.
Confessions listener.
No, I just think that's a great, it's a great snapshot of what kind of community we've got. Because I when I put all the contact points out there, I was thinking, oh well, here we go. I could get anything here.
Yeah.
And I didn't. So yeah, it's great.
Well, I'm certainly happy to have helped in any small way. Before we wrap up, if you have any your website or any like social media or anything you want to direct people towards, please mention that, and I'll link the article in the show notes and anything else you want to get out there.
I'm not really massive on social media because I don't have a great deal to report. I do still have my website up from my research if people want to read my old articles. I don't really update it. But it's there. It's just the Goth Just a Phase one. I think you've got it.
Yeah.
Yep. So that's still there. So that will show the process of the research, and it's all archived, but it's all there, and it shows from start to finish how it happened, how long it took, all the articles that I wrote while that was happening. So I think there's about half a dozen articles or something that I wrote while that was occurring, where I went, who I spoke to, what festivals I went to, all that sort of thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. Awesome. Great. Well, Emma, I think we will have to try and have you on again, but thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for sharing everything with us. It was, as always, a absolute pleasure.
Yeah, we'll definitely need you so back when you publish your book.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I can't promise anything just yet, but honestly, I'd love to get it out as soon as possible. It's been really a long slog, but I'm hoping to get it done soon.
Well, that's fine, because that was essentially the refrain, if I remember correctly, at the end of the last time we had you on 5 years ago. So we'll see you in another 5 years, I think.
Yeah,
that'll be good.
Let's hope it's sooner.
Catch up. Yeah.
Great.
Emma, thank you again so much for coming on the show and for the immense amount of work that you've put into collecting this data that I think is going to be beneficial to the community for years and years to come. I think as we kind of ran out of time, and as I've been editing this episode and thinking about what we talked about, I wanted to share some post-show musings, as I've started calling it. You know, sort of speaking to a comment Trey made actually around being proscriptive, and that Goth's fluidity is sort of maddening to traditional frameworks that are applied onto understanding culture. I wanted to explore that a little bit, because obviously social theory is an interest of mine, and I have sort of an idiosyncratic view of how culture is formed and how identity is formed, at least in the academic arena, and I think in the general social arena, which I'll kind of talk about. I think I want to tease that apart a little bit more explicitly than I have in the past. I think, first of all, I think in my own life, I've been trying to rethink the ways we conceptualize how we understand what Goth is. I think Western explanations, to be, abstract, Western explanations for, basically anything, but social phenomena in this case, tend to be totalizing, expecting that they can account for and explain all aspects of a thing with no partial explanations. And because of my fundamentalist background, I know I fall into that when it comes to a cosmology that explains everything. For me, there's a kind of welcome assurance in finding and enforcing meanings that are mathematical, universally common underpinnings, because it creates a sense of control and order if the world can be subdivided and quantified and understood at bottom, and then any kind of noise in the system can be hand-waved as human error. We all kind of do this. Taxonomizing everything, putting Goth into boxes. But I think to taxonomize is to totalize. And if you look to examples of how Goths do this, we sort of taxonomize in a way that reflects our own individual tendencies. So then when we or I talk about Goth, my preferences appear to be the objective perspective of the entire culture. And that's something I'm trying to get away from. I mentioned on the post-show musings in the last episode that there is a multiplicity of Goth identity, that there is maybe as many ways of being Goth as there are Goths. Emma talked about how identity is, you can be a Goth and a dentist, for example. And she mentions in her article as well that finding identity stability requires an ongoing series of decisions. Essentially kind of saying that identity is fluid and actively sustained rather than something that's essential or pre-existing. Because some people do think of identity as a static continuity. But I think we make choices and actions to bring forth our identity moment to moment. So if I go from the grocery store to the park with my kid to a club night, my identity is brought forth through those complex assemblages of organisms interacting with and in those environments. She put it as dialing various aspects up and down in the article. And I think, Chela Sandoval is an academic who talks about getting at this in terms of groups of people by talking about them as coalitions or affinities rather than an identity, to again sort of chip away at the idea that there is an essentialist criteria for sex or race or gender or political affiliation. Every goth is some other goth's poser, right? And so when we taxonomize, we are trying to enact a world that reflects our tendencies. Katie King talks about this as it relates to feminism and how taxonomies of feminism produce epistemologies that gatekeep any deviation from the quote-unquote official woman's experience. And what happens what she talks about is how this effort to create a totalizing experience through reductionism, basically, is counterproductive because it tends to recreate the kind of colonialism and scientism that's used against women in the first place. And, well, you know what? I guess before I talk more about how I see culture working, I should mention what a few of these terms I'm using mean. They come up often, and it would be, I think, useful to have a reference for this. So epistemology is about how we know what we know. So we produce these sort of taxonomies and precise objective measurements of what exists, at least what we purport to exist. And that hard science contributes in a cultural sense as the point from which an analysis is able to contribute to changing the way the world must flow. So an epistemological perspective it does a lot of things. It creates dichotomies, but it also assumes there is a pre-existing objective world. An ontological domain, which I believe I brought up earlier, but I want to talk about a little bit more, is a representation of some part of reality and the language and conceptualizations of that domain. In an activist view, which is where I sort of come from, and an actor network theory view, we talked about this when we interviewed my friend Paulo. That perspective is more related to understanding that ontologies are not human-specific theoretical posits devoid of materiality, but are distinct materialities which emerge within and through the very concrete practices involving arrays of diverse human and non-human actors, among many other things. But this relates to that notion of essentialism we talked about when I asked about authenticity and the idea that you are bringing forth, you are externally showing something that is internally irreducible, an essence, because that narrative plays into how we understand what is and isn't goth. Paulo de Jesus, again, who was on a previous episode, I'm pulling from his PhD thesis here. He says, quote, "Boundaries and distinctions, no matter how solid they might at first appear, are never fixed. They are always dependent on complex assemblages of sensing apparatuses, theories, concepts, mathematical description, and diverse observational practices, which are themselves variously entangled with the economic, the social, the political, and the ecological. Humans and non-humans alike therefore partially constitute and are constituted by the interactive process they participate in." And this is how I see ontology being brought forth, and included in ontology would be what goth is, how we view identity and the self, and what it means to exist. And culture as well, because when we talk about what constitutes culture, I take a lot from Paulo de Jesus, who I respect and who sort of turned me on to a lot of this literature. And then also people like Bruno Latour and Francesco Varela, among others. And they get at, Bruno Latour specifically gets at this epistemic perspectivism that is prominent in academia and modern culture, and he calls it the modern constitution. We talked about that on that other episode if you listened to it. But to quickly summarize, the modern constitution is basically the modern set of organizational practices, concepts, and arguments, largely derived from science, that put science, politics, nature, society, and so on into ontologically distinct categories or domains. So this lends to the notion that humans create culture because there is a nature-culture dichotomy. Nature is seen as something governed by mechanistic laws that underpin reality, and those fundamental forces of nature cannot themselves be changed by human interaction. This was a question I wanted to ask Emma that we didn't have time for, around how she sees sort of non-human material and non-human organisms playing into these networks that create goth identity, right? Because we talked about the role that history plays, the role that the internet plays, which is a non-human technology, and all these variously entangled networks that in a epistemic view would be considered their own ontological domains, right? Because that view sees the world as something that pre-exists with properties that can be discovered and analyzed, but are distinct from culture because humans are the only ones who live in and produce society and culture. This is another topic we explored extensively in our From Sound to Subculture episode, because they were also, the authors of that book were trying to get at a explanation of goth that does not exclude the role of material objects in the bringing forth of a goth identity for an individual and a group through actor network theory, which is Bruno Latour's theory. So this sort of ontological division of nature and artifacts goes back to Aristotle. But in the enactivist lineage, which is where my interest lies, the disagreement is that those epistemically divided domains are not pre-given or pre-existing. As I understand it, the argument goes that we enact those concepts and distinctions rather than the distinctions pre-existing and humans discovering them. And just to clarify, to enact something is to make it and remake it through specific and temporal and multiple material practices. Likewise, nature and culture are deeply ontologically entangled in contrast to the modern constitution. And so much so that we cannot understand one without the other. And one really does not exist without the other. A real-world example of this that Latour uses are technologies like frozen embryos, hybrid corn, gene splicers, that kind of thing. So, at least as I understand it, actor network theory does not take the social as a stable or human-centric domain, but argues it is composed by heterogeneous, fluid material entanglements and networks of human and non-human actors, which are as much a part of the social as the human is. It's also a rejection of mononaturalism, which claims that nature is singular and only culture is multiple. So all that to say, the way I view culture is anti-essentialist, anti-representationalist, and anti-anthropocentric, which means human-centered. I think that culture is deeply entangled or enmeshed in bundles of practices by networks of humans and non-human agents. So if we think about the world in this sense, the flexibility and fluidity of goth later into life, and again, this is all my perspective, not necessarily a reflection of Emma's research. This is my own view on the subject. But that fluidity and, negotiation of subcultural canon from the past and the boundaries of goth in the present makes a lot of sense, because we are essentially talking about what ways of being in the world are being maximized and normalized, I suppose, and what ways of being in the world are being minimized. And the conversations and engagements in the world in goth culture further perpetuate and sustain understandings of what goth is. So if we want goth to be more anti-racist or more music focused or more existentially focused, whatever that is, the interaction with these networks gives rise to these changes, which are both localized and individual, and also variously sustained and reproduced across larger swaths of society and the world. Ted Schotsky kind of talks about a flat ontology rather than a hierarchical ontology, where you would have sort of like a Marxist view or a structural functionalist view that sees society composed of agentic entities and forces working on people that then need to be resisted, right? Sort of a Frankfurt School idea of the resistance to capitalist marketplaces that are mediated by mass media. And then goth could be seen as resistant to the way that consumerism co-opts the transgression of goth into a commodity. This is what Spracklin's book, The Evolution of Goth, focused on, which we also talked about in a past episode. That framework sees capitalist marketplaces and mass media as acting entities rather than contextualized practices and concepts and histories and theories and bundles of organisms interacting with each other, enmeshed and engaged. And for me, as someone who has spent the last probably 13 years reading sociological theory, trying to understand why people act the way they do, what drives society, what subculture is, what culture is, how does that come to be? Is it a emergent property of the world? Is it a structuralist or volunteerist or whatever framework you want to use? And having collected, 60 something books on goth and read through all of these different modernist, postmodernist arguments for how that works, I think this for me is kind of what I've settled on as the best foundation to explain how goth is brought forth in the world and perpetuated. And this may have sounded like a lot of mumbo jumbo, but when you start to get to those questions of, is goth distinctive against a mainstream, or is goth diverse across states and borders and countries? What is it about goth that has stood the test of time? How does goth compare to other subcultures? All of these sort of big questions that everyone always asks whenever we get these types of cultural discussions in whatever online forums, or all the way up to the Den Bosch Museum's Gothic exhibit, where, myself and Trey and Catherine Spooner and the head of the Museum of Youth Culture, and others were on to talk about what is goth kind of thing. We're all using a variety of philosophical frameworks to understand this. And if you've listened to this podcast for an extended period of time, you'll have heard my views change over the years. And this is sort of where I've ended up. So I think looking at how long I've been rambling, I'll wrap that up there. I felt like I had the ability to talk about this on this episode specifically because it's more of an academic focused episode. But we have other content coming up, right? We're never doing just one kind of thing. And speaking of content coming up, our next episode is going to be another music mausoleum. So we're going to have a little bit of discussion between Trey and myself about a number of topics. We're going to be talking about the burnout on post-punk and darkwave a lot of people have been feeling recently. We'll be talking about Connor's comment on the last episode around modern goth music sounding like it's from the 80s. We'll be talking about genre classifications a bit, and then we'll be reviewing an album, and I will be doing mini reviews for, I think, 10 or 11 other albums, new goth music that's come out, because, again, supporting the music and enjoying the music is a very important part of the goth culture. So I always like to foreground the music whenever I can, even if my interests tend to lie in the social and philosophical, as you are no doubt aware. So that episode will be posted in about 2 weeks. If you'd like to get early access to that or a live streamed version of the recording of that episode, you can head over to patreon.com/cemeteryconfessions. Thank you again for choosing to spend your time with us on this episode. And until next time, stay dark.
The preceding program is a member of The Belfry, a network of blogs, podcasts, and videos for the darkly inclined. Go to thebelfry.rip for more information.